We all know the story, right? The cinematic, sweeping tale of a man falsely imprisoned who comes back as a mysterious, incredibly wealthy noble to just completely ruin the people who wronged him. But what if that legendary story of betrayal wasn't actually fiction? Seriously, what if the Count of Monte Cristo was a real person? Alexandre Dumas wrote a masterpiece, sure, but it wasn't just pure imagination. The crazy thing is it was grounded in a shocking, brutal, historical reality that most of us have never even heard of. And that reality belongs to a guy named Pierre Picaud. We're looking at a 10-year retribution that literally left Paris trembling. Picaud was just an everyday man whose entire life was shattered by a so-called joke. And trust me, the cold, calculated revenge he ended up taking makes the famous novel look like a walk in the park. Section 1. The Deadly Practical Joke. All right, let's dive right into this by jumping back to the year 1807 in Nimes, France. Pierre Picaud was a man at the absolute peak of his life. He was a highly successful shoemaker, and he was just about to marry a beautiful woman who also happened to have a massive dowry. Everything was perfect. But you know how it goes. Success breeds intense envy, sometimes from the very people you trust the most. Enter Picot's so-called friends, Lupin, Salieri, and Chobard. Lupin was really the mastermind here. He was driven by this dark, intense jealousy over Picot's upcoming marriage and his newfound wealth. So one night, these three guys are drinking in a dim tavern, huddled around a table, and they hatch an absolutely horrific prank. They decide to forge a letter to the French police, officially denouncing Picaud as a British spy. Now, we have to understand the context here. During the Napoleonic Wars, a charge of treason or espionage wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It bypassed standard trials completely. It was, for all intents and purposes, an immediate death sentence. These guys actually thought Picaud would just get locked up for a few days, miss his wedding, and look like a total fool. Obviously, the French police didn't find it funny at all. Right on his actual wedding day, with his bride literally watching in horror, Picaud was arrested and dragged away. No trial, no explanation, and he was completely oblivious to who had actually betrayed him. Section 2. Secrets of the Fortress. So while Picaud vanishes into total isolation, his betrayers just moved on. In fact, Lupin, the intensely jealous mastermind behind the whole thing, actually swooped right in and married Picot's devastated fiancée. 7. That is how many years Picaud rotted in the damp stone shadows of the Fenestrol fortress. 7 agonizing years. He was entirely forgotten by the outside world, just sitting in this tiny cell wondering how his perfect life had completely evaporated. But he wasn't entirely alone in the dark. In the cell right next to his was an Italian priest named Father Torri. If you're a fan of the Dumas novel, you're definitely going to recognize this. It's exactly where the character of Abbé Faria comes from. Father Torri became Picot's mentor, educating him day after day through a tiny crack in the stone wall. Right before the priest passed away in prison, he gave Picaud a revelation that changed everything. He told him about a massive secret, a hidden fortune back in Italy, and he left the whole thing to Picaud. Fast forward to 1814, the French Empire falls, and Picaud is finally released. He walks out of that fortress an aged, broken, but unimaginably wealthy ghost. Section 3. A Decade of Vengeance. Now, you might think he'd take all that money, go home, and try to find some peace. Nope. He emerged with one single, terrifying purpose. He spent years quietly tracking down the truth, finally uncovering the tavern joke and the exact names of the men who stole his life. So he moves to Paris under a fake name, and he kicks off this terrifying campaign of psychological warfare. Year 1, he settles in Paris under his alias. Year 3, Chobard is taken out by a hired assassin. By year 5, Salieri is fatally poisoned. It was a slow, creeping, methodical hunt. But then there was Lupin. For Lupin, a simple, quick death just wasn't going to cut it. Picaud wanted Lupin's life completely dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. He wanted Lupin to feel the exact same total, crushing loss that he felt back on his wedding day. The destruction was so incredibly cold. First, Picaud manipulates Lupin's daughter into marrying a criminal who then completely abandons her. Second, he orchestrates the burning of Lupin's restaurant, driving the man into total bankruptcy. Third, he actually tricks Lupin's own son into committing a crime, landing the kid in prison. It was only after Lupin was a ruined shell of a man that Picaud confronted him in a dark alley, revealed who he really was, and ended his life. Section 4. Truth behind the fiction. So how on earth did this bloody, brutal 19th century revenge plot turn into one of the most beloved classic novels of all time? Well, in reality, there are no happy endings for the vengeful. Unlike the fictional count who gets some level of redemption and sails off into the sunset, Picaud met a really tragic end. Right after taking out Lupin, Picaud himself was kidnapped and murdered by a man named Alute. And who was Alute? He was the fourth silent witness in that tavern who sat there, watched the original joke happen, and said absolutely nothing. The journey from that muddy murder to the actual publication of the book is pretty wild. Year 1, Alute flees to England after killing Picaud. 14 years later, he gives a deathbed confession to a priest. The very next year, that written confession gets filed away in the dusty archives of the Paris police. And then, 30 years later, a young writer named Alexandre Dumas stumbles across that exact manuscript. Dumas essentially took this raw, bloody, true crime story and polished it up for the masses. He gave us Edmond Dantès, a fictional tale of redemption, an island treasure, and this overarching heroic grace. But the brutal reality of Pierre Picaud? That was just poisoned wine, ruined families, and a tragic death in a dark alley. Which brings us to the core takeaway of this explainer. The most dangerous enemies aren't the ones we face on a battlefield. They're the ones who sit at our table and laugh at our jokes. It's chilling, right? This whole story is just a timeless warning about the absolute fragility of trust among the people we call friends. I really want to leave you with this final, provocative question to think about. Does the pursuit of justice inevitably turn the victim into a monster? Did Pierre Picaud's 10-year crusade make him just as evil as the guys who betrayed him in the first place? Think about that for a bit. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.